The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is flat networks inside the cloud and data center that allow threats to move laterally and compromise vulnerable targets. But microsegmentation using traditional firewalls is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach. Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation. Using the identity of machines and software that are communicating, Edgewise offers the strongest protection that adapts automatically to changes. Protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network by visiting securityweekly.com/Edgewise. Qualys has brought together vulnerability management and patch management, letting security teams discover vulnerabilities and apply patches immediately, all within a single, unified app. Sign up for a free trial of Qualys VMDR, vulnerability management, detection, and response today at securityweekly.com/Qualys. The average large enterprise has 24 million vulnerabilities. The good news is only 5% will probably be exploited. But which 5%? That's where Kenna comes in. Kenna Security's modern vulnerability management technology combines real-time threat intelligence, data science, and automated risk analysis to prioritize the vulnerabilities that pose the biggest threat to your organization. Team up with Kenna Security and make the most of your limited resources. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Kenna Security. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. If you want to stay in the loop, all things Security Weekly, make sure you visit securityweekly.com/subscribe, where you can subscribe to any of our shows on the Security Weekly network, subscribe to our YouTube channel, sign up for our mailing list, and join our Discord server. Also, if you missed Security Weekly Unlocked, you can access all of the content on demand, whether you registered before the live event or not. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked. Click the link to register or the button to log in if you previously registered. What's interesting is there were some, Larry, I don't know, I know you've been into the drone thing. There were some changes to the FAA regulations with respect to drones recently.
Yeah. I didn't pay a whole ton of attention to it. From what I saw, I want to say they relaxed some rules about flying at night and over people, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. And what's interesting is I was listening to some other podcasts and they were talking about that, and they were talking about DJI, and they started to mention like some of the privacy things, and they kind of brushed it off. And I'm like, well, you didn't see Kevin Finister's talk because you would be talking about that in a completely different light with respects to privacy and security. As it revolves around DJI.
And actually, just a couple weeks ago, they released, the government released some notifications, and I can't remember what the lists are called, basically blacklisting DJI from being bought by government
That's what it was.
Entities because of, quote, human rights violations.
I thought DJI was already blacklisted a while ago.
They were not. It is a recent thing.
Okay, then it was just a warning. Be careful. Yeah, got it.
Yeah, Kevin Finister presented at Unlocked on that, and it's much more than human rights violations. I don't think he got into. Yeah,
definitely. That's what they justified being on the blacklist for. But for sure, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's not out there.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I was busy pouring.
No worries.
Some good stuff.
Where do we want to start with the security? Nissan, not Nissan. It's Nissan, the car company, leaks some source code. I didn't really dig into this other than like I read the headline that Nissan leaks source code
of what?
Right.
Yes, I was the same. I pulled that article. I didn't get a chance to dig into it much because it's kind of been a crazy week here in the U.S.
Sure has.
And especially if you have other hobbies like OPSEC or busting OPSEC and those types of things. Let's see. It's the North American mobile apps and some of the Nissan Assist diagnostic tools.
That's interesting.
And a few other things.
Said it leaked from a Git server that was left exposed on the internet with its default username and password combination of, drumroll please, admin.
Nissan.
Admin.
Damn it.
What's that shirt we have, Paul? We drink because you don't change your default passwords.
Yes.
How is that even a possibility now? Like,
it's even
you would
worse than
think that they would
SolarWinds
block
123.
it really is.
It
Like, you would think
is.
that they would be able to block that, especially that combination.
Well,
Like the username being the same as the password's pretty obvious.
If only there was an automated patch for that. Damn it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Jeff,
Now,
when
Paul,
you were doing pen testing, like that was even before I was doing pen testing, but like that was one of the number one things you try is the username, the password the same as the username, right? Like that's had that
Yeah,
in our scripts.
we called it a Joe password.
Yeah.
It had a name and everything.
Yeah.
Well,
Now,
and
Paul, you said this
especially
was. Oh, sorry,
Larry,
Jeff. Go ahead.
I have
Go
to
ahead,
have
Jeff.
my stroll down memory lane.
Please do.
It was especially true because the early networks were Unix environments and everybody was getting a workstation,
Yep.
whether they wanted them or not. And the initial account setup, because everybody got an account, was usually the username and the username for the password. And of course, hopefully they were set that when you logged in for the first time, you were forced to set a password. But there were quite a few people in quite a few organizations like, I'm not going to touch that computer. I don't need that. I'm happy with my IBM Selectric typewriter with the bar that's got the Russian bug built into it.
Right.
So it was a very lucrative path very often in the early days to find any of these unused accounts that you would log in. You would get to set your own password and it became your account. And the little Unix message was, never logged in, have no plan. Because apparently there was some feature where you could set it to account. I never knew how to use the feature. I always just saw that never logged in, have no plan.
Right.
I should Google that.
You know,
See what it-
what's interesting though, back to our previous conversation with Ming, is about learning the necessary skills or a skill set for cybersecurity. I don't feel like I really began to start learning Unix and Linux until, to your point, Jeff, when I got to the university and they're like, here's your Solaris workstation. You're a Solaris Unix admin. Here's your Solaris workstation. And man, that forces you to learn a whole bunch of things. And I think today, that can be lost when you're handed your Mac or Windows or Chromebook and things just kind of, magically work. I encourage those that want to especially be on the technical path, or maybe not, but certainly the technical path in our field. And I tend to hand our interns, for example, I'm like, here's your workstation. And by the way, the hard drive's been wiped, and you have to install and use Linux on it as part of your journey.
Well, in my early consulting days in the real world, when I was working for consulting practices and startups, I mean, that was, we would go out and we got money to buy the, whatever the, best laptop was back in the day. And of course they were really expensive back then. But yeah, we would, they all came with Windows 95, which we would rip out. And that was always the joke, is like that, this should be a job, requirement. If we hire somebody, they have to be able to load an operating system like, Linux. We were using Slackware at the time.
On a big stack of floppies.
Yeah, it's like 18 floppies.
Yeah.
Floppies, the 3.5-inch variety.
Yeah.
Double-sided.
That was about
But the
Slackware
worst is when
2.0.
you're
Worse.
on like floppy number 18 and that one's corrupt and you have to start all over. Oh.
Dude, that was my roommate during summer intercession in 1995, installing Slackware 2.0 from floppies, and would get to like disk 18 or 19 and find out that disk was bad. It was like 3 times.
Yeah.
And then like you have to wait until the next day to go back to the university to do
To
some work to download that
right.
floppy.
It was never the first one. It was always like almost one of the last ones that was corrupt, right?
But to pile on to what you were saying initially before we went off on the floppy tangent, the resistance of people. Well, you were putting it in the context of being forced to learn. Here's a Solaris box, you got to use it. But I mean, I remember the resistance to people, because the first PC that people had in the workplace, and of course when I was I was working for the DoD at the time. We first got IBM PCs, so we all had our IBM PC with or without hard drives. I remember when we got the one that was it the XT or the AT that had the 10 megabyte hard drive. Oh my God!
Was that also
would be
the
the AT.
IBM Model 80 keyboards? Was that the clunky? Was it a
Something
Model
like
80?
that.
Was it a Model 80?
I don't know. But the point I'm getting to is I remember the resistance from everybody, possibly myself included. I don't honestly remember, but having to start using a mouse rather than just doing everything on the keyboard. And I remember I was working.
Was that 4-ohm or 8-ohm mouse?
I don't know.
I don't know. You said resistance.
You're being stupid.
Yes.
And I've been drinking whiskey all night. The 2-key mice versus the 3-key mice. What did Solaris have initially? And of course, I'm left-handed, so I wanted to reverse map it my mouse all the time. But I remember in the office that I was where I was first starting to do the pen testing, what became the pit. But before we were reorganized into the pit, the Fielded Systems Evaluation Office, which was mostly mathematicians and a few computer scientists and a few sundries like me. I remember there was a person that was hired that had gone straight through college, and this is an interesting story given our discussion on education. They had gone straight through college, undergraduate, master's, and doctorate. So we were bringing a doctor in. So this person was, it doesn't matter that they were female, but attractive young female, probably 24 years old. They'd done the whole doctorate in total in like 6 years, and it was like a doctorate in applied mathematics or something. I remember we got a copy of their doctorate paper, and nobody, we couldn't even understand the name of the thing, yet alone read the stuff. It's just, this person was extremely smart, and of course, because she came in with the doctorate, she got to get paid more because you would get increases based on your education level. And I was assigned the responsibility of teaching her how to use the Unix workstation, the Solaris workstation, and the mouse. And she was like completely lost on the mouse. I'm like, you're a goddamn freaking doctor in applied mathematics. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Did you hold it up and go, hello?
And you can't even use a mouse.
Did you hold it up and go, hello,
Beam me up.
computer? Hello, computer.
It was almost that bad. But anyway, let's get back to
Jeff, real quick. I had a professor that I had to support when I was back in the university days that literally picked up the mouse and it wasn't like use it on the desk. She picked up the mouse and would tickle the balls underneath to make it work.
She had experience, obviously.
Wow.
You had to go there.
Let's move on.
So I got some 3D printed Microsoft Word save icons.
Nice.
Oh, boy.
Damn it.
That's hilarious. And some people are going to fall for it.
Do
you have a 64 box of Crayola at your hands?
Not on my hands. It's in the other room.
That was truly a floppy tangent. A floppy. That's a great name for the episode, by the way. The floppy tangent.
So, Paul, to bring us back on that story just for a quick second. You said that it was their own Git servers as opposed to GitHub, like GitHub.com. And yeah, I would tend to agree. Reading through the article real quick, they did say it did appear that it was a Git server of some variety in a Bitbucket instance. And something similar happened to Mercedes-Benz earlier that had a GitLab server compromised in similar fashion.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's like the evil bad people, the evil hackers were like, we should go after source code repositories of automobile manufacturers. Let's go. Everyone rally around that.
Yeah. So Git is just not GitLab. Remember that.
It is not. Yes, they are in fact two separate products.
Or sorry, yeah, Git is not just GitHub. Remember that. It's GitLab.
How about Larry's number 8? This was on my list. I just couldn't get it to freaking add.
Oh, the great iPwn. Journalists hacked with suspected NSO group iMessage zero-click exploit.
It's not the first one that NSO's used over the last several years. I mean, all the things against all Al Jazeera, pretty much anybody in GCC. So this is really cool because of the capability and like the analysis that Citizen Lab did. They're picking a fight with a pretty big contender, but some of the stuff in here like makes you wonder what the level of security is on your phone when these are leveraged. Obviously, they're very expensive and you'd have to be very targeted, but it also makes you rethink your threat and risk matrix and profile from a targeted individual and how you would address that.
So wait, talk about the players, the NSO group and Kismet. What are these? What is that?
So Kismet is essentially what they're calling the
not the Wi-Fi utility from Mike Kershaw.
No. This is basically a zero interaction, 0 day in, up to date, all the way up to the last 13 update for all iPhones. And there was a couple others.
13.5.1.
Yep, 13.5.1. 14 supposedly has addressed this, but there's some controversy on just whether we've not seen the capability for that one. But essentially,
Tyler, specifically a no-click in iMessage.
In iMessage, yeah, which is iMessage or FaceTime. There's a kernel level call with inside of that iMessage and FaceTime utilize, and so it's questioned on whether or not it's used just via iMessage or via FaceTime, but it's a zero interaction exploit.
It's hard to turn that. I mean, I think it's easier to turn it off, right? Because you can go on your phone and turn off iMessage. At least you used to be able to, but most people don't because there's a social stigma about how people get messages and what color they are when they're on an iPhone platform. It's actually one of the reasons why I use Android, so I can change my default SMS app to Signal, and that's what I use because I don't like the Apple ecosystem. I don't like iMessage. I think it's creepy for a lot of reasons.
I don't think it would matter in this case based on the call that this is hitting. Mm-hmm. It's at the kernel level of where it's coming into.
But so Tyler, you can actually turn off iMessage on your phone and have it only use SMS or MMS. For example, I know one SANS instructor that I communicate with every great once in a while, who's a huge proponent of the show, and wears a Christmas hat from now and then, who I know is a huge Apple ecosystem guy, but every one of my messages goes to him as SMS or MMS and not iMessage because he refuses to use it.
Well, yeah, and one of the things is certainly for like non-security people, right? We're probably more aware of this, but any device that you're logged in with your Apple ID, you're going to get that message.
Yep.
Which is dangerous in my opinion.
Kind of the way that it hits is, if I remember right, it hits one of the launch processes. So when the message comes in, it hits one of the kernel launch daemons that has a very specific parameter that's exploitable, and from there, then it's able to do its implant. So it's Pegasus, which is the NSO software, and Pegasus has a ton of capability. Like, this has been around for a while. It's been leveraged by mostly UAE or one of the CGG, Saudis, targeting like Turkey, Al Jazeera. So Turkey's actually DNS sinkholed some of the command and control servers that are known for this. And so, like, once this thing implants, there's a whole bunch of analysis around like the IPs, what capability it has. You can track location, take pictures, download data, record audio, grab passwords. Like, it's a full suite of command and control on iOS, which is, obviously probably comes with a pretty hefty price tag. But these have been used to target pretty much anybody of influence over in the sandbox, right? So there's some interesting things around what this means from an iOS standpoint. It's always been viewed that iOS is, obviously secure. It's all sandbox. There's nothing you can do to get into it. But again, your risk profile and your targeting, you have to really understand that this is not the case for a well-funded and determined adversary. And Citizens Lab did a great job of really nailing down like all of the different pieces of how this spyware worked.
And the names in this particular stuff are amazing. Like Monarchy as one agent, and Sneaky Kestrel as another. And then a group apparently, or another agent operator, Kingdom. Like some of these names are just great. Yep,
They're cool.
Yeah, they've really spent some time like looking through this, and they don't waste any breath not calling out the actors or players with inside of here. And there is literally years of analysis here and some technical things that are really interesting from just from an exploit standpoint, but as from a risk standpoint, really understanding how some of this spyware works, where the players and actors are, and who's actually being targeted. It's not always players or people that are targeted that you would think, I think it's Ranani. She does a bunch of pieces from London on political things happening inside of different places over in Saudi, things like women's rights or sexual harassment, different affairs where people are getting called out. So she was actually one of the targets, and it looks like there was 5 or 6 different times that she's been implanted and didn't know it on different devices. So again, it's very, very, very interesting from like what it's interacting with, kind of some of the process it's calling between mobile mail. You got Exchange syncing, all of those pieces, and how that spyware is playing into the iOS ecosystem. Really makes you think twice about what you put on your mobile phone and what your data security policies are around that.
Not a great segue, but I wanted to talk about how the Shady 0-day sales game is evolving. Well, one reason I wanted to cover this is that Roman Sanikov, he's the director of cybercrime and underground intelligence at Recorded Future. Great dude, well trusted. I interviewed him at Black Hat a couple of years ago, and it's just amazing intelligence, into the cyber criminals and evil hackers of the world and hacking groups. And what Roman says that they're seeing, which I think is really interesting, and if you pay close attention to the articles we've covered on the show. Like, I didn't necessarily put the pieces together in my head until I read Roman's commentary, and that was, he said he's seeing people not selling vulnerabilities, but selling access that they've obtained using those vulnerabilities instead. Like, why give up your great 0-day if you can just use it to break into places and sell the access to that rather than the actual 0-day? I thought that was really kind of interesting, and I think really explains a lot as to what we've been seeing, right? Because we see different levels of sophistication. We're like, holy crap, that foothold they gained in that organization, that was amazing and brilliant. But then it's like, but it seems like another attacker got that and did some stupid shit with it. Like, wait a minute, they can't be the same. They can't be the same group. And this jives with that,
I mean, this is what we were saying when the pandemic started. In fact, before the pandemic started, like SaaS and the single sign-on, the access that those particular things have, that's going to become a bigger factor and a bigger play into things over corporate networks. SaaS as a service, and the things held in SaaS, which is software as a service, things like Slack or Teams or whatever your mail application is, those particular services often are going to have less protection and visibility than like a corporate network. And so the sale and access of those are going to be almost more critical and happen more often than the traditional vulnerabilities where you're getting into a corporate network, which is going to have vulnerability management, hopefully some monitoring and visibility in which you may get caught and may, not have access for very long. So the SaaS, we knew that was going to happen. 0 days, we knew that was going to uptick, but those are going to go up in price because everybody wants them because of remote workers. So this only is a logical stepping stone to where they're at now from a selling that access off, which we've always said APT groups have done. Like there's always contractors that do that and different groups that manage that access or gain that access. So this is nothing new. It's just an interesting light to show some of the dark web side of how those sales are happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think also the execution sometimes of that exploit in 0 day is also not the same person that may have discovered it and wrote it, right? I think that there's a huge family tree or matrix of, if you will, of all of this nefarious activity, right? There's like one group that's creating the exploits. They may sell it to someone else that's skilled in getting the foothold, and then someone else is buying that and doing the whole thing. I think we sometimes can lose sight of just like how deep that rabbit hole goes and how segmented it really has become. And I think that's been a shift over time. I think 20 plus years ago, you probably saw the threat actors maintaining that whole chain, right? Of I mean, back then you probably didn't have to create an exploit. If you did, it really wasn't as complex as it might be today, right? And you were in control of like that whole chain. And over time, I think slowly we've seen that separation of duties and have it be very segmented is what it's become today.
I think bug bounty places are one of the next kind of big targets. They were already a big target to begin with, a place that curates and brokers those 0 days. But I think there's going to be a point where there's some of the gray bug bounty programs where, hey, we'll negotiate this or strong arm the company into, accepting a bug bounty if they don't have one, or the bug bounties in themselves are obviously going to be targeted. I think bug bounty programs are great, and you need to have that, because if you don't have a way for people to disclose it properly, it will get disclosed other places and people will get frustrated. Yep. We've seen this before. But that also leads to a very large target from the standpoint of, if I was going to go after someone, it would be pen test companies and it would be bug bounty, because they have the keys to most of the kingdoms and the ability or the means to get into some of those.
Mm-hmm. Is that why you think FireEye lost some of their tools? Because like but I think there's a maturity curve, right? There's like people on the lower end of the maturity curve that maybe don't have the skill sets in tools enough to reach that point of breaching someone like a FireEye, and then there's kind of like that sweet spot of, yeah, I can either like buy my way, like I can buy 0 days and maybe buy access, and I'm going to get those tools. Then there's that higher end of the maturity curve that's like, we've got another agenda, and we don't really need FireEye's tools, but someone else along the chain might have, accessed them. And as we've seen with SolarWinds, that can blow up the whole operation.
Target of opportunity, right? Like maybe they did not know what FireEye had, or they were looking for a capability to bypass FireEye for a very specific operation once they're using SolarWinds for like a Fed government, because FireEye's in Fed government. SolarWinds was a mean, and it was, obviously deployed in FireEye as well. So I think those things all just kind of circulated and played into each other. And I don't think they really needed FireEye's tool set in any way, shape, or form.
That rabbit hole goes deep. I think we're still even just scratching the surface of. I'm waiting for the book to come out. Like, I'm totally on board. I want to read the book and interview the author when it comes out. Like, I really, that's where I'm at.
Yep. So what was one of the ones that came out earlier this week about SolarWinds? So FireEye brains.
Oh, sorry, Larry, you broke up there.
JetBrains.
Yep. So FireEye to SolarWinds to JetBrains. Like, JetBrains may have been the initial vector that JetBrains had their stuff compromised.
Yeah. So was it JetBrains that was compromised, or someone just had a 0 day in there? What's interesting is I flagged this story. One, because it was related to SolarWinds, and two, because I'm a JetBrains user. I love their software; it's awesome, and I've looked into, have not implemented. I think in this case, fortunately, I have not implemented some of their tools that support the SDLC in DevOps.
Maybe you want to stay away from Team City right now.
Team City is their product that looks like what was their Team City product? It's something to do. Does it compete with like Circle CI and Jenkins? Yeah. Hassle-free CI and CD server by JetBrains. I would put that in the same category as a Circle CI or a Jenkins, right? Helping you automate your. Yep. It says actually people also search for Jenkins, GitLab, and things like that. So, yeah. And that's really that type of software. If I'm doing a supply chain attack, that's definitely up on my list, because for a lot of reasons, right? I mean, it's in the SDLC for sure. And also my experience configuring tools such as this is that it has to trust and have credentials for a lot of different things to automate the process, right? Like when it has to have access to your source code repository, but then it has to take the source code from there, it has to do shit with it, and then send it to other places, and maybe multiple places, right? Like it has to send it someplace, spin up the environment, run tests against it. So it needs to be able to spin up your environment, but also access, maybe some kind of scanning software or unit testing software. Then once it's done with that, then it has to push it to production. So like this type of software, like in Team City, has a whole ton of access to everything.
That's what Sean and I were talking about on ESW, right? Is like, where is the permissions? What permissions are you looking at? SolarWinds was a network appliance. It had, it had to have visibility into different network segments and have that administrative access that it thinks it needs. So this is no different. Something like Jenkins is going to have, like you said, right within that pipeline, it's going to have those things like VMware tools, Intel, drivers, like all of these companies that were compromised as part of SolarWinds. Like you said, this was just the opening volley, and each one of those, there may be things that we haven't seen, we didn't detect, we may not see for a while. Just getting access to some of Microsoft's source code, which they haven't even fully disclosed what that means. There's a pretty big iceberg here to kind of look at and think about from an adversary standpoint. Not that we don't have a lot of capabilities, but we are not as aggressive or offensive and blatant in the way that we do things. This would not be something we'd do against private companies. To say someone like China, unless there's a very specific mission that was, overseen and part of, an action. This is kind of blatant from a different direction.
I didn't know. So this article says JetBrains is founded by Russian software developers and based in the Czech Republic. I didn't know that.
Yeah. But they're also saying that they don't think it was compromised. It was just it was misconfigured.
Well, yeah, I can see that. Yeah, because this type of software in your DevOps tool chain, the configuration is ridiculous, and it gets harder and harder when, Tyler, back to your and Sean's point of trust, right? Trying to grant it permissions, but then grant it like temporary positions, tie it into your vault because it needs all kinds of credentials and certificates. It also has the managed certificates too, right? Like as a developer, I don't need the production level SSL certificates, right? But I give those access to those certificates to my CI/CD pipeline. At some point, it has to go pull those SSL certificates to push them in production. So yeah.
And then you add something like a password vaulting solution or some kind of password proxying solution, and you've added another layer of complexity to developers that are already having
a huge amount of so complex that a lot of people don't have that level of sophistication yet because it is really complex. Interesting. Yeah. Well, more unfolding. I think we'll talk about SolarWinds every week, probably for a while. It's my guess. There'll be some new development. Oh, speaking of bug bounties, U.S. government has announced Hack the Army 3.0 bug bounty program conducted by the Defense Digital Services is invitation only. And then the Department of Defense does have an ongoing vulnerability disclosure program that is public where anyone can report security holes anytime in exchange for thanks. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But they do have an invitation-only program, which is kind of hinting towards that there is monetary compensation for. I don't know if that story's all that interesting, but
I think it is. I mean, the invitation only, I think, is a good idea for things like that because how do you tell the difference between you can have plausible deniability from like a nation state standpoint if you're hacking against something that you're authorized to hack against, right? Because it's a open bug bounty. So I think that invitation only is a great idea and a means to kind of curate some of that without offsetting the liability and plausible deniability that someone might take up.
Lee, I want to go to you for Ticketmaster because I think this story is really interesting.
Yeah, well, when we were talking a few minutes ago about credentials and access being available to the dark web, here's a case we had employees with access to sensitive data and sensitive documents for a Ticketmaster competitor that I believe got hired by Ticketmaster, or maybe they just made them available, and the Ticketmaster staff were running around the competitors' systems just doing incredible damage. Disrupting sales or convincing artists that the other platform was no good and that they should be selling with Ticketmaster. And it comes down to the people left, but their credentials weren't turned off. What the heck?
Yeah,
How many
but, like,
times have we
that
talked
falls
about?
into like not cool. Also, probably illegal.
Yeah, I think it was
right?
really. Yeah, this. I mean, this feels like not unethical behavior on the part of Ticketmaster, and that's why they're getting that $10 million fine. I mean,
I was gonna say they got fined $10 million, right?
yeah, because it was viewed as it was condoned. I mean, and encouraged. It was
Right.
like, what the hell? It's bad
Well, I mean,
enough.
this goes
you've
back
got
to
that.
good business practice, right? Like if you have good business practice and you're always continually improving and building better products than your competitor, then that's your advantage. When you're something like when you see things like this, that tells you obviously they're not being innovative enough and they're spending a large amount of time, resource, and business risk to just flat out crush the competition via illegal means. Like that should say something about the company itself and the products itself.
Yeah, I mean, taking your credentials to your new job at a competitor and then letting your new job use those to do stuff is, I mean, that is like one of the most unethical things you can do. Of course, I mean, you shouldn't take anything with you, right? But I mean, sometimes you do take stuff as a reference. There's a big difference between, taking some of your notes or documents or whatever and using them as a reference. Another thing, if you're taking the intellectual property, like rebranding it and selling it, like that's also hugely unethical and illegal, and it'll get you in trouble in court, right? And get you sued, but potentially in prison, depending on what the circumstances are. But there's also some due diligence on the company that you're leaving to make sure that you're turning off credentials, that you're doing exit interviews, that you're protecting your intellectual property, and things of that nature, right? But obviously what Ticketmaster has done is atrocious.
And then on top of that, it wasn't just the person that left the company. It was like a whole bunch of folks at Ticketmaster were using those credentials. So it was like they were passed around and encouraged to use. I mean, I feel like that kicks the ethics thing just way up there. And
completely agree.
Just, ouch.
To be studied in ethics courses in technology for years to come.
Yeah.
Creating your own custom encryption in Python.
Oh, hell yeah.
I read the title.
What could possibly go wrong?
Right? That was my reaction, Larry. I read the title. I was like, all right, hold on. Like creating your own encryption, whether it's Python or whatever it is, I'm like, probably bad, right? And Jeff, I appreciate and completely respect your examples of we create a crypto algorithm and we put it out there for public scrutiny. That is definitely a thing. I think there's also the situation where I'm not going to use a standard that has been publicly scrutinized. I'm going to come up with my own that hasn't undergone scrutiny, that always ends up badly, right? Ending badly. But in this case, when I started digging the article, I was like, oh shit. I'm like, this is awesome. They created their own crypto scheme. I would call it, I mean, more like a cipher, if you kind of dig into some of the details in this article, right? Basically their own cipher, so that when you create a C2 channel, when you've gained a foothold in an organization, it doesn't match any filters or signatures or behavior or whatever from any kind of security tooling, because you've created your own cryptographic cipher and mechanism for creating an encryption protocol. It is in fact your own. Therefore, it's not going to match any detection mechanisms that are looking for things like even RC4 or whatever, SHA-1, even if it's an encryption or cipher algorithm or hashing algorithm that has been proven to be insecure. That's not the point. The point is create something that's not going to throw any red flags. And I was like, that's actually a pretty cool article.
So similar to like XOR with a key. Based off an environment variable.
Yeah.
Well, you're not creating something that's intended to stay encrypted to the end of the republic. You're creating something that solves a short-term problem, which means a whole different level of rigor.
Yeah, Lee, it's interesting. Like when you put it that way, it makes me think of like it's for a very specific use case. That oddly enough, for encryption, it's not about really protecting the data. It's just about evading detection.
Yeah, and it is really cool, by the way. Don't let me take that away.
Where's Joff?
This is cool.
Was it more like a shift? I don't know, Jeff, if you read this article, but it was like some of the you talked about the things you used to get in cereal, right? Where what do you call that? Where
Secret decoder ring.
the secret decoder ring, right? Kind of
What?
cipher.
Always drink
cipher
your
wheel?
Yeah, the cipher wheel. What do you call that? You
Like
developed
the
one.
thing I invented?
Yeah, the
Funny
thing
you should
invented.
mention that.
What is that? There's a name for that that's escaping me. What is that called?
If it's in the cereal, it's the secret decoder ring,
Right.
or just more generically, it's called a cipher wheel.
Cipher wheel. Yeah.
They might. I have not read the article. I apologize. But Lee beat me to the punch in terms of there's a difference between you're trying to protect the data for millennia, not against millennials, but for a long time, and doing something for a very short amount of time. If you're trying to protect the GPS coordinates for what used to be the bombing run, but is now the drone run, you have to protect that for a lot shorter amount of time for the person that's deep in the executive levels of, I have to use the old context of the Kremlin, that's sharing secrets with you and has been doing so for 20 years, and you need to protect his identity forever because his wife, his children, his relatives, his ancestors will all pay the price if it's ever found out who he is. There's a huge difference in terms of what what's the goal? What are you trying to accomplish with the encryption? I mean, the software-based encryption system that I developed, which was just taking a one-time pad and putting the key on a floppy disk. It was a 3.5-inch floppy for those keeping score. Was being used, and the algorithm was built into a computer program, Turbo Pascal, by the way.
Oh, that's amazing.
As
I learned Turbo Pascal in high school. Imagine that.
Well, and you were probably in high school when I was inventing this thing, fielding it. But
90s, probably before you were doing that. Before that, before the 90s, or it was 80s.
It was 80s. Yeah, we fielded it. In fact, there used to be this really cool thing called a day timer. It was like a little scheduling calendar journal.
Yeah,
I gotta get it. Yeah. And I have some old sheets of a day timer from 1990, February to be exact.
I remember day timer. Yeah, that's before we all had smartphones, right? And Google Calendar. And
it's an analog BlackBerry, is what it is.
Yep.
But I kept a little travel journal of the trip that I took to Germany, because the wall had come down and it was unified Germany, to field this one semi-automated, I called it a semi-automated one-time pad, but it was software-based encryption. My point is, it was running on one of those IBM PCs that I mentioned earlier, and these PCs were not networked. I would not, for the life of me, ever recommend what we built and what we created to be installed and used on any kind of networked device at any time. It was good for the time, it was good for the day, but there was no inherent security in it because it was running on a computer, and if you could get to the computer, you could get to the data. At the time, it was encrypting the data that was going to be transmitted and possibly intercepted. That security was okay. So all that to say is, to use the modern terminology, what's the use case? So it could very well be cool, and I will read the article because it's crypto.
Yeah, no,
and there's a lot of ransomware that uses similar things that rely on keying variables, times of day for C2, different C2 servers to call back to, encrypting the C2 server list, or dynamic lists that are then rolled out via DNS. Like, those things are kind of starting to become the de facto and standard for even the ransomware or off the shelf kind of commoditized spyware and ransomware. So I think we'll see more of that.
Yeah. So I was wondering if we wanted to move on, because I had my number 2 I wanted to ask Larry about.
You're reading my mind, Lee. I wanted to hear about your story number. I was just literally going to ask you about your story number 2, because I think it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, so it's a new malware that's basically grabbing your using your BSSID and your IP to get your geolocation, using this free BSSID to go geodatabase, which I hadn't heard of before. I hope Larry's heard of it. I mean, I'm used to I don't know if it was Larry who introduced me to Wiggle, but it was in that same time frame when I was taking classes from him, and I just thought it was really interesting that. Although it's not, the fidelity is low, it's still good enough to find and locate people when they've got that. And I thought, what the heck? There's more accurate ways to do it, but this is more than accurate enough. That comes back to our crypto conversation, doesn't it? So apparently there was some research by Xavier Martins over at SANS who discovered it.
I mean, there's been Wiggle's been around for, geez, how long, Larry? Wiggle's been around since 2009.
Oh gosh.
I was going to say, really, at least 10 years, right?
Yeah, Wiggle came back. It started back in the day when we were using NetStumbler.
Yes.
Yeah.
Before VI Stumbler, when they redid the wireless stack and Windows. Yeah, it's been around a long time.
Yep, and then you start to combo that with some like ad tracking data and or other Wiggle type things that are pulling stuff from apps on phones. Like you wonder why the app needs access to certain things or permissions. Oftentimes, that location tracking is being fed to a different database that is correlated to another product, and this is a great example of why those things actually matter.
Yeah.
The interesting one that I found about this is that the BSSID to geolocation database is one that's not anything new. It's an aggregate of other stuff, and actually hasn't been updated in a significant amount of time. As in, currently the data is outdated. It's along the lines of what we found with Wiggle.net for a long time, in that they didn't get rid of any data, and a lot of the data ended up being stale. And I think a decent amount of the data at this database is in fact fairly stale.
Well, you think about how many Wi-Fi cards have been used and then thrown out over time, right? Because your BSSID is just the MAC address of your radio, right?
Right.
It's the MAC address of the radio in the access point.
In the access point, right?
Yeah, it's not your client; it's the access point. And this is very similar to what all of the parties do, like, specifically in my stuff with Apple that I worked on with Don Weber, from some stuff with the undocumented API calls from Apple, that. They're doing their own tracking with BSSID, the MAC address of the access point, the wireless adapter and the access point, and location. That Apple had their own API for querying that stuff, and you could query it with a MAC address, and it would return you the location of that access point and 40 of its closest neighbors.
Wow. Which you could then cross with Wiggle, right?
Yep.
That's
absolutely. You still, or in the converse, you could take data from Wiggle and geolocate and do some other stuff. So,
right.
Yep, you needed the BSSID. You needed the MAC address of the access point that you were connected to.
Well, so you were talking about the data being stale. I'm wondering how often are people replacing their access points for real? Is it that if the data is 5 years old, is it still pretty good? Or pick some arbitrary value.
I'd say 5 years is good, but that was one of those interesting things that came out of that project that Don and I worked on for that. In that the point that we were trying to do with no GPS was to be able to do geolocation after the fact, after we had collected wireless data, because GPS wasn't available to us. We were like in a metal moving truck. And I asked the community through the show and Twitter and otherwise to, hey, if you have any really large dumps of war drives, would you be willing to send me one? And I had a gentleman that sent me a war drive of when he drove cross country.
Ooh.
Wow.
Which was fascinating.
Remember when
Which
we
was
used to do
exactly
war
the type of
driving?
data.
That was fun.
Yeah, well, people still do.
It's still a thing.
Still a
Still
thing.
Tone Loc is
Yeah.
not a musician.
Yeah. So this data was basically from coast to coast, east to west, and the data was
Funky,
already
cold
4
Medina.
or 5 years old at that point when I asked for it, which was fascinating because when I post-processed it, you could very much see that at the time when it was collected, the map did this. But when I asked Apple where those access points were now, it went like access points had clearly moved and they were geolocated at new locations, including access points that had moved from the U.S. to foreign countries.
Oh,
No
yeah,
way.
but that makes sense though, right? If you think about, because we're all nerds, we've all been having Wi-Fi for a really long time, and I think we're all kind of with the mindset of like we don't like to let things go to waste, right? So we either sell them or donate them, so they end up in foreign countries somewhere, right? Or we take them from home to work or other different locations, right? We have this access point at home. It was the shiny new hotness 5-10 years ago. But we're like, yeah, I got a new Wi-Fi system at home, so I'm going to take that old one and give it to my friend, give it to my relatives, take it to work and use it for some specific purpose in some other location, right? So that totally makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah.
Or people moved as they do.
Yep.
The one that I thought was crazy, where when I was looking at it, that access points that were logged as the war drive in the U.S. moved to a foreign country, where they actually had to get a voltage converter to make the access point work in the new country, or a new power adapter. Like, really? So.
Well, I do know that we have occasionally sent the Swedish family things here that need to run over there that are 110 volts from here, and it's like completely trivial for them to get it going on 220. It's like they don't even think about it.
Yeah,
it's so I guess that's easier, a lower bar than we think, Larry.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I mean the other thing you have is correlation of cell tower and cell tower to BSSID information that maybe private companies can do, and there's private database that has access to that kind of stuff. But even Wiggle, I think since like 2017, they were collecting cell tower locations and uploading heat maps of cell towers and the power based on the app from phones. So it is still a big thing, and there's still a lot of data being collected by Wiggle, upwards of, I think last checked, it was like 500,000 or 500 million different individual access points that they had tracked on there. And so, yeah, there's a ton of data that could be correlated. And there's other private, obviously, databases that have some of that information too. So you can imagine when that data gets into certain hands, it can be very valuable and very useful.
So looking at wiggle.net right now, Tyler, there's just shy of 300,000 submitters to the site. 711 million networks.
Jeez. So it's went up quite a bit.
205,000 submissions today. 382 million Bluetooth devices and 15 million cell towers identified.
See, now the Bluetooth thing also makes some very interesting data and interesting correlations that you can then start to infer based on a lot of different data points. Again, you start to think about how ad tracking data works and like what information and identification and IDs they're using in order to correlate that data. Sometimes that's a Bluetooth device, sometimes that's a phone identifier, sometimes that's a cell IMEI. Like all of those things kind of play into it. And if that is public data, then there may be some interesting correlations that you can draw from that.
So don't do anything stupid or the drone strike is coming right to you.
Which I'm sure there's already some Secret Service agents and some private companies helping correlate that data for all of those dumb people that had their stupid phones while they were committing whatever you're going to call it.
Which was probably all of them.
Yep.
Well, how else are you supposed to get TikTok famous?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The irony of looking at some of this Wiggle data, one of those things we get back from the students every once in a while is that, oh my God, no one uses WEP anymore. Oh, actually, looking at the data that Wiggle has, their data says 4.89% of all of their access points are using WEP, where WPA1 is 4.69% of the overall data, meaning more people are using WEP than WPA1 as opposed to WPA2 or WPA3.
I mean, you might as well just make it open at that point.
Backwards compatibility
Agreed.
for medical devices, maybe?
All sorts of stuff. All sorts of stuff.
I'm going to bite my freaking tongue off.
But open access points must be more than WEP and WPA combined, no?
According to this data, unencrypted is 3.1%.
Interesting.
Really?
Yep, and that is data as of today. So 1/7/2021. So now, granted, they have 18% unknown.
Interesting. Does that tie into my story number 7 of FBI warns users of swatting attacks by hacking smart devices?
It does.
I mean,
now.
I guess you have their address, so using other means of geolocating them is
But
an academic exercise, right?
that's interesting from like a Wi-Fi calling standpoint, right? Like if you're going to do this from a mobile device and like address location via E911 systems that
Right.
don't have the ability to turn on that dynamic locator, and you're calling over Wi-Fi, how can you correlate that, and then how can you provide attribution to that? So I think this actually could become a much bigger problem in the future.
Yeah, I mean, but this story got slightly out of hand in my assessment because it says their FBI warns users of swatting attacks by hacking smart devices. The smart device is not the vehicle for executing the swatting attack, right? The swatting attack, you got to know where the person lives, and you have to call in an emergency where the SWAT team is dispatched, right? Tyler, to your point, right? Like you have to make a phone call. You have to make a phone call. At the end of the day, there's a phone call to a physical address. The hacking smart devices is so that they can monitor the swatting taking place and stream that and record that over the internet. And what this article said was communicate with the SWAT teams when they're on site. Like, because a lot of these Ring devices, Nest devices, whatever, right, have voice communications with them. So, like, you would call in a swatting attack. Again, let's just preface this whole thing. This is highly illegal, and you're going to end up in prison if you do this. This is an illegal activity, and it's also, like, the most douchebag thing you can do to someone, basically. It's awful. But they're executing, despite all of that, they're still executing these attacks. And now they're like glomming on this extra thing where before they swat you, they hack into your IoT devices so they can stream the footage, record the footage of you getting swatted, but also communicate with the SWAT. Like, what would you say to the SWAT team that shows up? Would you just reinforce the emergency? Like, well, I don't understand what the purpose of communicating with the SWAT team, like over your Ring doorbell or security camera that has two-way voice communication.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to read this article because that's that's interesting. Like if you're using the Wi-Fi to then route like SIP traffic or route some kind of Wi-Fi calling via a smart device that has calling capability, like maybe the Ring device can call out because it's got 24/7 access. I could see that, but
they're just password spraying, right? They're getting a dump online. And they're going, yeah, your Ring password was the same as whatever password was in this dump. And I don't like you, so I'm going to call on a swatting attack. And I'm going to log into your Ring device through the cloud, right? So they're not actually accessing the device. They're logging into Ring's cloud, which is talking to your device. And through Ring's cloud, they can have two-way conversation with whoever's standing there on your front porch.
We would call that a skiddy attack, and back in the day, you get kicked off of a forum.
Yeah, absolutely. It's total skid.
No.
skid
and I think the FBI notification here is that they are using those type devices to carry out the SWAT attack, meaning they're like doing the credential stuffing against, say, Ring.
Yep.
They're getting into your Ring account, and then they're potentially using those creds with the Ring app or with the Ring online service to press the emergency panic button to have you call 911.
That makes more sense,
Yep.
Larry. Yeah.
Yep.
I didn't know you could do. I guess in some of these devices, well, SmartThings you could, right? Because SmartThings will act as your home security system, and that's the same thing as Ring, cloud-connected IoT system.
I think Alexa has that ability built in too for like call 911 or I'm having an emergency. There's like a key phrase you can set up. I think you have to turn it on. I don't think it's on by default. But
Gotcha.
So
I wouldn't trust that though, because
what if someone says that over the TV?
So in my car, and I need to turn this off because it gets really annoying. But also there's a usability feature where like if you want to do the GPS while you're driving, you have to enable the Google Smart Assistant. But if you enable the Google Smart Assistant when you're driving in your car, if you're listening to a podcast or an audiobook, and they say anything that could remotely sound like the keyword phrase to activate the Smart Assistant, it pauses your audio and makes the annoying ding, and it's like, oh, did you need me for something? Like, oh, hey, Dave,
would you like
I'm
to order
here.
100 pounds
You
of
can't shut the bay doors, but I'm still here for you. And I'm like,
don't call me Shirley.
Right? Or don't, yeah. It's
and yes, I'm serious.
Highly annoying.
So the other thing that the FBI was talking about is that a lot of these are getting through password reuse. They've captured somebody's email account credentials. It's in a dump somewhere.
Yep.
And they use that same password with Ring or Nest or whatever the hell.
Right.
And so they're just slipping in easily because the FBI was saying, look, don't reuse your passwords. And if these things support multi-factor, turn it on.
And it's mostly SMS two-factor, yeah. But Ring and Nest specifically have, because of previous attacks,
yes,
I think required it, right? I think I use both, but one of them required it, right? I'm not sure if both did. But the other thing is, since Nest is a Google company, they're like, well, you need to tie this to your Google ID.
I was going to say, what about single sign-on?
Yeah, I'm kind of like, I don't know how I feel about that. Like, I have two-factor turned on my Google account, but I don't know if I want.
But what if they're compromised and that permission that you've given that application can then access something via the permission you've given it?
But then there's also like SMS phishing. Again, with Google, you have more options than just SMS, right? Because Google actually does a pretty good job at the options you have for two-factor. Some of the other companies may not. It may only be SMS. My story number one is actually Logarithm actually did a really good job of saying how they help telecommunications companies, for example, be able to spot someone who's trying to commit fraud to gain access to your cell phone account, right? They take in all of the data from the systems that are tracking IMEI tied back to the user in being able to prevent someone who's doing a SIM swapping attack or social engineering to gain access to your account, right? You can totally see how that would be possible. I don't normally put vendor stories right here on this show, but I thought they did a good job of kind of pointing out that that's something telecommunications companies should do. So it's like, who do you trust and what lengths do you go through? For the average user, I'm very concerned. For us more advanced users that maybe have a YubiKey, my concern is I want my YubiKey to be my second factor to all these other services, but they don't support it. And that's maybe you do go to Google, right? Because my Google account is protected with my YubiKey. But then you also fall back to SMS. So we like end up in this like round robin kind of thing. Like how do you lock down your accounts?
Again, single sign-on and SaaS. They're going to be the bane of most of, I think, the next generation of standard hacking and like where the attacks are going to start proliferating. You're going to see SaaS applications in single sign-on C2 or ransomware that begins to download and then delete your Gmail account or your Gmail app or permissions from one application, then taking over and propagating through to another application that you've given permission. Like or these are like already happening.
Application requests that just lie to me. And I'm like, oh, I'll give you my password. And you know what? I'll give you my second factor and I'll authorize you. And we all know OAuth as a protocol is not horrible. The implementations can be horrible. And so now I've just basically circumvented all the protections I've put in place. My username and password is one. My second factor is the other. I've authenticated, and I've granted this service permission, but it's totally a fake service. I've just given someone access to my account. It doesn't matter. I could have 3-4 different factors of authentication. It wouldn't matter. I've just granted the service access to my account, and now my account's been taken over. Doesn't matter how many factors of authentication I have. That's scary to me.
And that doesn't even take into account all the single sign-on or application permissions that the third-party solutions are then passing through. I mean, the back ends of a lot of these are AWS IAM or Azure, federated of some kind. Those permissions that those applications and companies are then granting and passing through to secondary companies. Like this is going to be a big issue that we're going to run into.
Because I think we as security professionals are mindful of all of this when we configure our accounts. We're like, okay, I know I've got multiple Google accounts, I've got multiple Microsoft accounts, and I use when I log into another service and or grant another service access to my account, I'm doing the threat modeling on the fly, right? And I'm trying not to put all my eggs in one basket, right? Some sites I'm like, I'm not going to tie to a federated identity of any kind because of the risk level. But your average users, they're not doing that threat modeling. Like, that just kind of comes second nature to us. Like, we're so paranoid, we do that threat modeling all the time. So we're limiting our exposure to, like, okay, when I log into my financial accounts, I want to use an email address that's somewhat separate because I have probably at least at last count, I had 14 different email addresses, right? I want to use one that's maybe just for financial access. It's not federated, and the second factor is something that is completely separate and or a physical token, right? But not everyone's going through this kind of threat modeling.
Yeah, and then the auditing, like even, I mean, we're all guilty of this, going back and auditing, like, hey, that application that we no longer use that was cool back then, you know, maybe it was like some task, like we gave it permissions way back to the Google thing. That application's permissions and token is still valid because it's got an application, token.
Right.
Those auditing pieces and the things that we've done over the years as things have advanced, we're all guilty of not going back, checking that, and removing or continually cleaning up those things.
And never using Facebook's federated identity ever, other than to log into Facebook and maybe Oculus, right? Like
damn Oculus, like why? Like, I love it.
The Oculus, right? And even us as cybersecurity and it was some of my friends that are our mutual friends that I won't name by name have gone, the Oculus is so cool. Like, I don't give a shit that I got to use a Facebook account for it. Like, I'm going to do it anyway because it's just such a cool device, right?
That's what they banked on, though.
Santa brought an Oculus, and myself and the family, we all love it. It's friggin' awesome, right? But I'm like, damn, I got to tie it to my Facebook account. But I don't want to tie my Facebook account to anything else. And that's really not a security thing more than a privacy thing for me. Because Facebook to me is just creepy when it comes to privacy.
Depends on the apps you put on your Oculus, right? Like the ability to virtual desktop to your computer and have a 270-inch screen or multiple screens that you can do Oculus shit on. Like, that's amazing. However, man, what kind of communication protocols? How is Facebook doing the authorization of that? Like all of the back end stuff that I started looking in on this, it's all bad. Like, this is all going to be another, like, as soon as I'm doing Cobalt Strike on Oculus, which is freaking phenomenal, like hacking and joining a team in virtual reality to hack something. That's phenomenal.
Do you have flashbacks of like the plague in Hackers where he was using the VR, right?
Except we got multiple teams. Because you can collaborate with inside of Oculus, right? And you can share apps and pass application views between each other. So it's like a great collaboration platform. But now you're looking at this and you're starting to evaluate, like, okay, so what communications is happening wirelessly? What is the Oculus doing? How are those servers handling the communications and all of that? Like, trying to threat model this before you use it, and it's all bad. Like, I think we're going to have an entirely different problem or set of problems with VR that we've had on other applications and devices. It's going to be the next mobile platform that has issues.
Yep. Yeah, I'm kind of less concerned about like, okay, Facebook knows like what games my family and I are playing. I'm like, I don't know if that really matters at the end of the day, right? Because, I mean, as most of us know, like your browser history and what games you play is probably, it's tied to some account somewhere. I don't think that's the huge privacy concern there. Maybe you're doing other things with the Oculus device. I don't know. It's all shady.
Do they have porn for Oculus yet?
Next topic.
Why? I mean, they have to now.
What I was reminded of, though, if you watch the Amazon show The Feed, it's actually recommended by Kavya Perlman, who came on the show, to watch the Feed. And I did. I watched the whole thing, binge watched the whole thing. And I'm like, you spot on, because that was amazing. I mean, it takes in all multiple concepts, some of which we've talked about just now, right, and rolls it into a show. And one of the things that it depicts in the show that's super creepy is one of the characters, I won't spoil the plot, but like one of the characters in the show creates a virtual version of his ex-girlfriend, and it's super creepy. And I'm like, when I put the Oculus on for the first time and started using it, I was like, oh, and like, family members were joking about porn, like Larry was, and I'm like, yeah, no, but it's super creepy because like I watched the show and I'm like super creeped out by that. Like there's like, it went back to kind of Kavya's points about that in privacy and things of that nature. I'm like, yeah, no, that's super creepy. And you should go watch the Feed, especially if you've done the Oculus now, and now you go back and watch the Feed. Like you're gonna be totally creeped out.
Great.
Yep.
You're not getting me to watch Hackers again, Paul. I don't care what you say.
Yeah, but the scene, but also Jeff, to that point, because in Hackers they show, which is many videos I've taken to my family because it's absolutely hilarious to watch someone who has the Oculus headset on and the controllers, like they're in the virtual world, but you're an outsider looking in. It's kind of like you're looking at the cocoons that all the people are in the Matrix, right? Except in the Oculus, they're like interacting with things and moving around. It's hilarious to watch. Like I have videos of my wife, and she's like, if you ever show this to anyone else, I will murder you, because she looks ridiculous.
So now you have to share,
right? And my kids, like they look ridiculous when you're Tyler, right, and Larry, you guys have the Oculus. Mm-hmm. Like, people look ridiculous when they're interacting with things. Like it's hilarious to watch.
Yep. Kristen used it once. I have a picture of her. She says they look ridiculous, and she hasn't used it since. Yeah,
I have video of my wife using it, and I like it is the most entertaining video ever. Like it's awesome.
See, my kids to mess with me when you're submerged into the virtual environment.
Yeah.
Like one of the games we have is like one of the zombie hunting type things. Yep. And we stream it to the TV. We cast it to the TV. And of course, what do they do? Like as soon as the zombies pop up, like they sneak up and they poke me in the side. I'm like, son of a...
Yeah, you don't want to get near anyone using the Oculus because you will get hit. Like that's the other lesson we learned as well. Yeah.
Yep.
I think there's a lot of applications though that we haven't even addressed from that standpoint. Like again, I've been working on a whole talk around this, like hacking collaboration from an Oculus, what you can do to like improve productivity. But then you talk about privacy. Like if you're on an airplane and you're working on a document, like that's a problem we all have, like shoulder surfing, having to have the screen protector on there, like only working on certain things, code names. Having an Oculus sitting there, and I'm able to sit and work on, whatever I want and watch whatever I want without worrying about someone looking over your shoulder or seeing things. That's also some benefit that I think is going to provide some interesting things moving forward. Maybe we start to see that as kind of a standard in airplane or in, whatever.
So Tyler, you can live your dream of watching porn on an airplane and not worrying about anyone judging you.
But the problem is you can't tell when the stewardess comes by to offer you more drinks.
Yes, there's that too. You are disconnected from the outside world for sure.
Yeah, they're gonna have to have the in entertainment pop up on your virtual environment saying the stewardess is next to you. Please take your headset off.
Yeah, it's like I would like a drink, please. Like
the problem is when Tyler's watching porn on the airplane in his Oculus, he gets a pop up of a different kind.
That's actually one of the funnier quotes I've heard from you lately, Larry. That's great. There was a couple more stories before we round out the show. UnCAPTCHA 3 evades Google's audio reCAPTCHA with speech-to-text API. Basically, this is using Google to hack Google. So the idea is very simple. You grab the MP3 file of the audio of reCAPTCHA and you submit that to Google's own speech-to-text API. Google will return the correct answer in over 97% of the cases. Again,
Jesus.
This is with reCAPTCHA that requires user interaction. Google's more advanced CAPTCHA works more like bot detection that does not require user interaction. We did a webcast and I believe a segment on one of our shows last year with Google on that front, and they made great strides, but they haven't like deprecated all of the reCAPTCHA stuff, so it's still out there, and that's what this particular research was attacking. And there was
that's kind of novel. I wondered when they were going to do that with images, right? Like image recognition, which is pretty good.
Right, ML with image recognition is we've proven that works, right?
Yep, and or crowdsourcing, like some of the new CAPTCHA stuff is from Google is click all the pictures that have a picture of a chimney.
Yep, and you outsource that to actual people, right, in their return results.
Yep, or the the meme this week that was one of my favorites is click the picture with all of the assholes, and it's got all of the U.S. politicians and like dog butts. And if you just pick the U.S. politicians, score, like
yeah. And then there's the one of vision, right? And it's like when you fail a CAPTCHA for 3 consecutive times, and it's a picture of Vision from the MCU. It's like, maybe I am a robot. That was pretty good too. Also, Google related as well. There was a Google plugin. Oh, what crap I lost. Oh, here it is. A Chrome extension with 2 million users changes hands, raises red flags, and doesn't document any updates. This is very much a supply chain attack. Not quite on the level, of course, of SolarWinds and some of the other supply chain attacks we've seen, but a supply chain attack nonetheless. The issue was with a Google Chrome add-on called the Great Suspender. And I was like, what does this Chrome plugin do that it has 2 million people interested enough to install it? It actually pauses non-active tabs in your Google Chrome browser so it doesn't eat all the resources on your computer. I'm like, actually, I can kind of see people using that because, as we know, Chrome will eat as much resources as it can.
And some of us have lots of tabs open, Tyler.
Lots of tabs.
My computer literally just blue screened from tabs.
Some people why do you need the latest AMD with 16 core, Ryzen 9 5900X? And I'm like, Chrome, basically, which is still not available, which is highly irritating, which is a whole other subject. But
tabs and VMs.
Tabs and VMs. And so this changed. There's a whole story behind it. Like, it changed hands, and then it started. Once it changed hands, it started collecting all kinds of open source and used an open source analytics package to collect a lot of information about users and started doing nefarious things, which is why I highly scrutinize every single browser add-on, whether it's Firefox, Chrome, or whatever browser that's installed, because even if you do scrutinize it, this is a great example of it's going to change hands to someone who may not be as trusted, and then you're screwed. That's a concern.
Yeah, you start to think about some of the browser extensions. In fact, I've recently reconsidered some of the extensions that I had for things like saving your tabs in case your browser crashes, right? Like, with inside of those, you don't know exactly where that data is going. And with inside of a lot of the URLs, you have tokens, you have JWT in the URL itself as a parameter. Like, when it's not done right, there are things with inside of those that can be used to authenticate against your stuff without having to have a password.
Oof. Scary stuff. That will, I think, round out the show for this evening. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. Larry, take us out.
Over and